The small-town diner on the edge of Route 17 was a haven for travelers and locals alike. With its neon sign flickering against the twilight sky, it drew in people with the promise of good food and a warm atmosphere. Among the evening crowd, one particular customer sat quietly in the corner booth, sipping a glass of water. He was young, barely 17, but there was a confidence about him that made him seem older. His name was Alex Carter. Alex was no ordinary teenager, a martial arts prodigy. He had been training since the age of 5 under his grandfather, a retired martial arts master who had earned legendary status in their small community. By the time Alex was 14, he had competed in and won several national championships. His movements were sharp, precise, and almost superhuman. But despite his talents, Alex remained humble and unassuming, never seeking out conflict. On this particular evening, Alex was on his way home after a long day of training. His grandfather had reminded him, as always, to stay calm in the face of adversity and to never misuse his skills. These words echoed in Alex's mind as he glanced at his phone, checking the time. His focus was interrupted by the loud roar of motorcycle engines outside. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner shifted abruptly as a group of bikers rolled into the parking lot. Their arrival was announced by the screeching of brakes and raucous laughter. There were 5 of them, tough-looking men clad in leather jackets and boots, with tattoos snaking up their arms. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a menacing grin, stepped off his bike and strode toward the diner. Inside, the chatter died down as the bikers entered, their presence commanding attention. The leader, who went by the name Tank, scanned the room with a sneer. His crew followed close behind, their boots clunking heavily against the tiled floor. Alex glanced at them briefly before returning his focus to his phone, determined to avoid any trouble. Tank and his gang settled at a table near the counter, their loud voices disrupting the quiet ambiance. They barked orders at the waitress, who nervously took their requests. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, unwilling to provoke the group. After a few minutes, Tank's gaze landed on Alex. The teenager's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him. "Hey, kid!" Tank called out, his voice booming. "What are you doing here all alone? Shouldn't you be home playing video games or something?" Alex looked up, meeting Tank's gaze with a polite but firm expression. "Just having a quiet evening," he replied, his tone even. Tank chuckled, nudging one of his crew members. "Quiet evening, huh? Well, maybe we'll make it a little more exciting for you." The gang laughed, and Alex felt the tension in the room escalate. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of his grandfather's teachings. Avoid conflict if possible. Unfortunately, Tank had no intention of letting it go. He stood up and sauntered over to Alex's table, towering over the seated teenager. "You got a problem with us, kid?" Tank asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "No problem at all," Alex replied calmly. "Just minding my own business." Tank leaned closer, his grin turning into a scowl. "You think you're better than us or something?" Alex shook his head. "Not at all. I just don't want any trouble." "Too late for that," Tank sneered. He reached out and knocked Alex's glass of water onto the floor, the sound of shattering glass drawing gasps from the other patrons. "What are you going to do now, tough guy?" Alex's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, his hands resting on the table. "Please," he said quietly, "let's not make this worse." Tank laughed, clearly enjoying the intimidation. "What are you going to do? Call your mommy?" The gang erupted in laughter, but their amusement was short-lived. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo on his neck, reached for Alex's backpack, which was resting on the seat beside him. "What's in here, kid? Homework?" Before he could open it, Alex's hand shot out with lightning speed, grabbing the man's wrist. His grip was firm but controlled, and the biker winced in pain. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Alex said, his voice steady. The room fell silent. Tank's grin disappeared, replaced by a look of annoyance. "Let him go," he growled. Alex released the man's wrist, and the biker stumbled back, rubbing his arm. Tank stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You think you're tough, huh? Let's see how tough you really are." The other bikers stood, surrounding Alex's booth. The patrons watched in horror, some pulling out their phones to call for help. The waitress, trembling, whispered to the manager to contact the police. Alex sighed, standing up slowly. He didn't want this fight, but it was clear that the bikers wouldn't back down. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. "Please, just leave." Tank laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Hurt us? That's a good one, kid." What happened next was so fast that most people couldn't follow it. Tank swung his fist, aiming for Alex's face, but the teenager moved like a blur, sidestepping the attack with ease. In one fluid motion, Alex grabbed Tank's arm and twisted it, forcing the larger man to his knees. The other bikers lunged at Alex, but he was ready. Years of training kicked in as he dodged punches and countered with precision. One by one, the bikers fell, each of them incapacitated within seconds. Alex's movements were a perfect blend of speed, power, and control. He used their momentum against them, ensuring that his strikes were effective but not overly harmful. The fight was over in less than a minute. Tank and his crew lay groaning on the floor, their egos bruised even more than their bodies. Alex stood amidst the wreckage, his breathing steady and his posture relaxed. The diner erupted in applause. The patrons, who had been terrified moments earlier, now cheered for the young hero. The waitress approached Alex, her hands trembling as she handed him a napkin to wipe his hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved us." Alex smiled, his modesty shining through. "I just did what needed to be done." The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as the police arrived. The officers entered the diner, taking in the scene with astonishment. After hearing the accounts of the witnesses, they escorted the bikers out in handcuffs. As Alex prepared to leave, one of the officers stopped him. "Kid, that was incredible," he said. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Alex shrugged. "My grandfather taught me." The officer nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, if you ever decide to join the force, let me know." Alex chuckled, thanking the officer before stepping outside. The cool night air greeted him as he walked toward his motorcycle, a modest but reliable bike his grandfather had helped him rebuild. He put on his helmet and started the engine, ready to continue his journey home. As he rode off into the night, Alex couldn't help but smile. He had stayed true to his principles, using his skills to protect others without letting anger or pride take over. His grandfather would be proud. And somewhere, in a small house on the outskirts of town, an old martial arts master smiled knowingly, as if sensing that his grandson had just passed another test. Share your thought in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting stories like this for you, and your support is the one helps me keep going. I appreciate having you on this journey,